On the night Glenn Rhee and Abraham Ford were murdered, Negan told Rick something. He said that Rick was going to have to learn to live with what he had just seen, that he was going to go back to Alexandria and he was going to find a way to work for Negan, because that was how this world worked now, and that if Rick understood that, if he really understood it, then everything would be fine. And for nearly an entire season, Rick seemed to believe him. The version of all-out war that actually aired, the one that ended with Negan's throat cut and his life spared and the communities rebuilding together, required a specific and precise sequence of events to unfold. It required Eugene to eventually sabotage the Saviour's ammunition. It required Dwight to maintain his cover as a mole for months without being discovered. It required the Scavengers' betrayal in the Season 7 finale to be survivable. It required Simon's rogue massacre of the Scavengers to turn Jadis against Negan at exactly the right moment. Take any one of those things away, and the version of events you just played out in your head does not happen. The war ends differently. Negan wins. Tonight we are going to trace the exact moments where the outcome hung in the balance, make the case for how each one could have gone the other way, and then follow that alternative history to its conclusion. What does the Walking Dead world look like if Negan wins all-out war? What happens to Rick, to Maggie, to the communities that fought against him? And what does Negan's civilization, the one he was actually trying to build, look like when there is no one left to stop it? Get comfortable. This one is going to take a while. Part 1. Understanding what Negan was actually building. Before we can talk about what Negan winning looks like, we need to understand what Negan winning meant to Negan. Because there is a version of this conversation that treats him as a simple monster who wanted to rule through fear. And if that is all he was, then Negan wins just means everyone suffers forever. That is not a very interesting thought experiment. And more importantly, it is not what the show was depicting. Negan articulated his philosophy of governance most clearly in 2 scenes during Season 8. The first is the pre-war council meeting and the big scary you, where Simon suggests completely destroying one of the vassal communities to make an example of them. Negan's response is furious and immediate. He shuts the idea down hard. People, he says, are a resource. The whole point of the system is that the communities produce, and the saviours take half. Killing everyone eliminates the production. It defeats the entire purpose. When Simon pushes back, asking what the point of the whole thing is, Negan says it simply: they are building civilization. They are the only people in this region doing that at any meaningful scale, and every unnecessary death is a step backward from that goal. The second is his extended conversation with Gabriel while trapped in the trailer during the Sanctuary siege. He describes watching his wife die of cancer before the apocalypse, the failure of what sounds like a first attempt at leadership in the early days after the collapse, the way he had to build something harder and more controlled when the world demanded it. He is not performing for Gabriel. Gabriel is not an audience worth performing for. Not in that moment. Not trapped together in a metal box surrounded by walkers. He's explaining himself to the only person present, and what he explains is a man who genuinely believes that the structure he has built is the only viable structure for this particular world, and that his half-and-half tribute system is preferable to the chaos and predation that characterised the world before he established control over it. This is consistent with what we know about the Saviour's origin. According to the Sanctuary law, before Negan took command, the Saviours were led by a different and apparently more chaotic leader who Negan described as running gangs of animals. Negan, with Simon's help, took control and imposed the structured tribute system, the point economy, the council hierarchy, the rules about when violence was and was not authorised. He built an organisation out of what had been a collection of violent opportunists. The Saviour organisation, at peak strength, was significant by any measure of the Walking Dead world. Estimates based on what the show depicted put them at roughly 400 fighters at the start of the conflict, with several hundred non-combatant workers at the sanctuary and across the outposts. They ran a functioning internal economy on a point system that workers used to buy food, supplies, and services. They had 4 major outposts outside the sanctuary, each commanded by a lieutenant. Simon managed hilltop relations, Gavin managed the kingdom, and the show takes care to note that Gavin actually respected Ezekiel and found the kingdom an honourable tribute partner. Eugene eventually oversaw the bullet production facility, the council as established in the Season 8 episode The Big Scary You included Simon, Dwight, Gavin, Eugene, and Regina, with defined roles and clear lines of authority. Below them were soldiers and workers in a tiered structure where exceptional loyalty or skill could earn promotion. This is not a raiding party. This is a government. Brutal, extractive, and operating on fear rather than consent, but a government with institutional structure and internal rules that Negan enforced even against members of his own organisation. He executed people who raped. He punished lieutenants who exceeded their orders. He maintained rules because, as he said explicitly, rules give structure to civilization, and civilization is what he believed he was building. Understanding this is essential to understanding what a Negan victory actually produces. It is not simply an extension of the cruelty of Seasons 7 and 8 indefinitely into the future. It is the establishment of the saviour system as the permanent political architecture of the region, with all of the specific consequences, positive and negative, and deeply complicated, that follow from that. A world where Negan wins is not a world of endless darkness. It is a world where a specific and genuinely flawed version of order becomes permanent in ways the show never had to explore because Rick's coalition prevented it. Part 2. The 4 moments. Negan almost won the all-out war narrative in Seasons 7 and 8 has 4 specific points where the outcome was genuinely contingent on individual choices that could have gone the other way. This is not speculation about broad possibilities. The show establishes each of these clearly enough that you can trace them scene by scene, and in several cases the characters involved discuss what would have happened if things had played out differently. Let us go through them in order. The first moment is the Season 7 finale, the first day of the rest of your life. Rick had spent months building his coalition. He had the Scavengers, Jadis's junkyard community, who he had recruited through a combination of negotiation and a genuinely impressive demonstration of personal combat that Jadis had staged as a test. He had the Kingdom, after Carol and Morgan persuaded Ezekiel that the Saviours had to be confronted. He had the Hilltop, with Maggie's growing de facto leadership, and the community's genuine desire to fight. He had Oceanside's guns, taken without their consent, but taken nonetheless, giving the coalition significantly more firepower than it had started with. He had Sasha in Negan's custody, prepared to sacrifice herself. He had Dwight's cooperation from inside the sanctuary. The coalition was not at full strength, but it was the closest it had ever been to functional. And then, at the exact moment the confrontation with Negan began, at Alexandria's gates, Jadis and the entire scavenger community turned their weapons on Rick's people. They had been negotiating with Negan as a parallel deal, playing both sides, and they chose the stronger bet. In a single moment, Rick went from commanding a coalition that had genuine fighting capacity to being surrounded by a new set of enemies, while Negan's forces were outside the walls. Sasha's attack, her reanimation inside the coffin after taking Eugene's cyanide capsule, and lunging at Negan when he opened the lid, created the chaos that let Rick and his people survive the moment. Even then, the battle was not clean. Michonne was badly beaten in a watchtower fight with a scavenger. Rick was captured by Jadis. It took Shiva's arrival with Kingdom forces plus the hilltop fighters Maggie had brought to actually turn the tide. The scavengers fled. The saviors retreated. Without Sasha's sacrifice, without Eugene providing her the means to die inside that coffin on her own terms, there is no chaos. There is no distraction. Rick is a prisoner or a corpse before Season 8 begins, and the war is over. The second moment is the Sanctuary Siege, mid-Season 8. Rick's opening gambit in the actual war was an extraordinarily sophisticated multi-stage operation. The Coalition approached the Sanctuary with a massive convoy of vehicles covered in metal sheeting, which they used as mobile cover while firing into the Sanctuary's windows, shattering them. Then Daryl led a walker herd, which had been assembled specifically for this purpose, into the Sanctuary through the newly broken perimeter. The walkers flooded the grounds. The saviors retreated inside. Negan was trapped in a trailer with Father Gabriel. His military organization, hundreds of fighters, was contained inside its own base, unable to project force into the region, burning through whatever supplies they had within the Sanctuary's walls. Eugene broke the siege. He devised a plan to use a modified remote control aircraft, a toy plane attached to noise-making equipment, to lead the walkers away from the Sanctuary by drawing them with sound. The plan succeeded. The walkers dispersed. The saviors had an exit. They escaped, regrouped, and launched devastating counterattacks that included the near-complete destruction of Alexandria. They hit the hilltop. They struck at multiple coalition positions simultaneously, overwhelming the communities that had believed the siege strategy was working. This is the moment that the show itself treats as the war's most critical contingency. Dwight, who was also at the Sanctuary during the siege, knew about Eugene's plan and tried to stop it indirectly. He specifically did not shoot down the aircraft when he had the opportunity. He told Eugene afterward that the saviors had already lost the war and that all Eugene needed to do was nothing. Eugene did not listen. He launched his plane. And the siege that could have ended. All-out war in a matter of weeks instead became a multi-month grinding conflict that cost both sides enormously. The third moment is Simon's massacre of the scavengers. Negan sent Simon to the scavenger junkyard to punish Jadis and her community for their eventual switching of sides back to Rick, with explicit orders to kill one person as an example and leave the rest intact. Simon's own philosophy, as established across Season 8, was that Negan's approach to community management was fundamentally too lenient. He believed in elimination rather than subjugation, and he used the opportunity Negan gave him to act on that belief. He massacred nearly the entire scavenger community, leaving Jadis as the only significant survivor. Dead City in 2023 added significant retrospective context to this moment through the character of the Croat, who in flashback describes himself as one of Negan's original lieutenants, someone who deeply respected Negan's system and his approach to governance. The Croat explicitly contrasts himself with Simon, saying Simon never really listened to Negan. The implication from Dead City is that Negan's defeat in all-out war was at least partially attributable to having the wrong lieutenant in key positions. The Croat, who respected the philosophy, would have killed one scavenger and left. Simon killed almost all of them because Simon was running his own philosophy under cover of Negan's authority. The consequences of Simon's massacre were cascading. Jadis survived with a powerful motivation to punish both sides. She captured Negan during the events of The Key, transporting him in a shipping container to her junkyard with apparent intent to feed him to a walker. She had access to a helicopter almost certainly connected to the CRM organisation that becomes central to the franchise's later mythology, that she was signalling for evacuation. If she had followed through, Negan would have been removed from the war entirely by a side player whose community his own lieutenant had destroyed. He survived that encounter only because he made a sufficiently compelling case for himself. Simon's decision to massacre the scavengers nearly delivered the war-ending blow against Negan through a completely indirect route. The fourth moment is Eugene's bullet sabotage. In the Season 8 finale, Wrath, Rick's coalition faces the full Saviour army in what appears to be a carefully designed killing field. Negan has organised 11 groups of 11 fighters in surrounding positions, intending to trap the coalition at the hilltop and destroy it comprehensively. The whistling that opens the confrontation is the same sound that accompanied Glenn and Abraham's deaths, deliberate and psychologically targeted. When the Saviours opened fire, every weapon failed. Guns exploded in their handlers' hands, barrels ruptured, mechanisms seized. Eugene had been building flaws into the Saviour ammunition for weeks, small but critical defects that caused the casings to fail under the pressure of firing. The entire Saviour firing line collapsed simultaneously, and Rick's coalition charged into the chaos with fully functional weapons. Negan was struck by flying shrapnel from his own exploding gun. Many Saviours were killed or badly injured by their own weapons. The battle was over before it truly began. Eugene's decision to sabotage the ammunition was the single most consequential individual choice of all-out war. It was inspired, as Eugene confirmed afterward, by Gabriel's earlier and failed attempt to sabotage Saviour munitions from inside the sanctuary. The chain of influence from Gabriel's failed attempt to Eugene's successful one is one of the show's quieter structural achievements across Season 8. Without Eugene's sabotage, the Season 8 finale is a massacre of Rick's coalition. The coalition cannot fight its way through 11 organised Saviour units, with coordinated positions using fully functional weapons. The war ends in the field. Negan wins. Part 3. The immediate aftermath. What Negan does. First, let us take the most interesting version of the alternative. Not the simplest one, where the scavengers' betrayal in the Season 7 finale succeeds, and Rick is killed immediately. That version produces an interesting world, but it cuts the story short before the most interesting questions can be asked. Instead, let us take the fourth moment. The Season 8 finale plays out with functional Saviour ammunition. Eugene stays loyal to the Saviours. The battle happens as planned, with full Saviour firepower. What does Negan actually do? The answer, based on everything the show established about his character and his philosophy, is not what Simon would have done. Simon would have killed everyone. Negan would not. Negan's entire argument, made explicitly and repeatedly across Seasons 7 and 8, is that killing people is a waste of a resource. The communities of Alexandria, Hilltop and the Kingdom represent enormous productive capacity. Farmers, doctors, builders, fighters who could be redirected into his organisation. Destroying them is exactly what he told Simon not to do, exactly what he fired Simon for planning, exactly the thing he was most opposed to as a governing philosophy. What he does first is make a scene. Negan understands theatre. He understands that the moment of victory needs to be performed correctly, needs to be witnessed by enough people in enough communities that it functions as a permanent psychological reference point. The war has been costly, and a victory that is not adequately displayed is a victory that gets quietly relitigated in the minds of people who were almost there when it went the other way. So there is a gathering. There is a lineup, perhaps in a field that the coalition would have recognised, perhaps at the gates of the hilltop, somewhere with enough witnesses from every community to ensure the moment is communally experienced. Rick Grimes almost certainly dies in this version of events, not because Negan wants to make an example through cruelty, but because Rick has demonstrated definitively and repeatedly that he cannot be controlled through submission. The Season 7 experiment, the entire first half of the war's build-up, proved that Rick's compliance was always a performance of time-buying, rather than genuine acceptance of the new order. Negan, is intelligent enough to understand that keeping Rick alive, in any form, even imprisoned in the deepest cell of the sanctuary, creates a permanent rallying point for future resistance. Rick is too famous, too admired, too fundamentally central to the identities of the people who followed him to be safely kept alive after a failed war. If Negan kills Rick, he does it in front of witnesses, and he does it in a way that is framed around Rick's specific choice to start the war, rather than around Negan's desire for revenge. This is important. Negan does not want to be the villain in the story people tell afterward. He wants to be the authority that Rick chose to challenge, and that the challenge of the war confirmed. Rick's death, in this framing, is a consequence of Rick's decision to go to war, not a demonstration of Negan's power for its own sake. The framing matters because Negan knows he has to live among the people who loved Rick for the rest of however long his system survives. Maggie Rhee is a more complex question. She is pregnant at the start of Season 8, and by the finale she has emerged as the de facto leader of the Hilltop. She is also the most personally motivated opponent of Negan's in the entire coalition, the widow of the man he murdered on camera in front of their community. She hated Negan with a clarity and intensity that was qualitatively different from any other character's feeling about him, and she had the leadership capacity to translate that hatred into organised action, keeping her alive and giving her any kind of authority at the Hilltop is a perpetual security risk that would require constant management. But killing Maggie Rhee after killing Glenn Rhee, while she is visibly pregnant with Glenn's child, would generate exactly the kind of existential rage in the communities that destabilises the very production Negan needs. The people of the Hilltop watched Glenn die. They followed Maggie because of what Glenn meant and what she represented. Kill her, and you do not just create grief. You create the specific kind of grief that converts the most passive bystander into someone willing to make a suicidal sacrifice if it means taking a piece of Negan with them. Negan's most likely solution is removal. Maggie is relocated far enough from the Hilltop that she cannot organise resistance in conditions that are technically survival but are not flourishing, not executed. Exiled to the margins of the system. The child she carries when it arrives becomes the most complicated figure in the alternative history's later years. Glenn and Maggie's child, growing up knowing what was lost and what was done to their parents, knowing the story from whoever has access to tell it. That child is the most significant, unwritten story in the alternative history, the one that connects the defeated generation to whatever comes next. Daryl Dixon is another specific case that Negan would have to handle carefully. Throughout Season 7 and 8, Negan showed genuine interest in Daryl as a potential saviour asset. He spent significant effort in Season 7 trying to break Daryl through isolation, humiliation, music at 4 a.m, and the specific psychology of captivity. He offered him a lieutenant position explicitly. None of it worked. In an alternative history where Negan wins the final battle, he likely tries again from a position of total victory, where Daryl has no allies left to hope for and no rescue coming. The question of whether that effort would eventually succeed is genuinely the most uncertain character question in the entire alternative history. Daryl Dixon's stubbornness has always operated on a level that most people, including Negan, found difficult to fully account for. Carol Pelletier is the most operationally dangerous person in the alternative history for Negan to have alive and unaccounted for. She has demonstrated across multiple seasons that she is capable of extraordinary and precisely targeted violence when she believes it is necessary, and more importantly, she is capable of disappearing entirely when she chooses to. She made herself invisible to the saviours for an entire season, while living in a house barely outside Kingdom territory. In a Negan victory scenario, Carol most likely does not present herself for capture. She is gone before the battle is fully resolved, and she begins whatever version of ongoing resistance is available to one extraordinarily capable person, with no army and no community, and no one to answer to but herself. Part 4. The Restructured Communities. After the immediate aftermath of the military defeat, Negan's primary task is consolidating control over communities that have just watched him destroy their coalition's fighting capacity. He has done this before with each of the communities individually, but he has never had to do it after a war. The psychology is different. The Hilltop, Alexandria, and the Kingdom did not simply fail to resist. They organised, recruited allies, fought for 2 full seasons, and were defeated. The people who live in those communities know they tried. They know the names of the people who led them. They know what was attempted and how close it came to working. That knowledge persists, and Negan is intelligent enough to understand that the post-war community management challenge is fundamentally different from the pre-war community management challenge. His most likely approach is differentiated by community because the communities have different characters and different strategic values that require different management. The Hilltop is his most complex post-war problem. It was the most militarily capable of the 3 major communities, the most ideologically committed to resistance, and Maggie's leadership had given it a coherence that Alexandria had lacked under the original Saviour occupation. With Maggie removed and Gregory presumably restored as the nominal leader, which suits Negan perfectly because Gregory's collaboration was never ideological and his cowardice makes him a reliable instrument, the Hilltop's institutional coherence is disrupted. But the farmers, the doctors, the craftspeople who made the Hilltop productive are still there, and Negan needs them functional. His approach to the Hilltop is probably the most lenient of his post-war settlements, precisely because the Hilltop's value to the saviour economy is the highest and most direct. The Kingdom presents Negan with a different kind of challenge. Ezekiel's leadership had always been theatrical, a performance of sovereignty, maintained for his people's morale, even while he secretly complied with saviour demands. In the actual timeline, Gavin managed the Kingdom relationship with genuine respect for Ezekiel, and acknowledged that the Kingdom had been an honourable partner in the tribute arrangement. In the alternative, if Gavin survived the war, his relationship with Ezekiel provides a template for what managed coexistence can look like. Gavin is the saviour lieutenant who most clearly embodied Negan's philosophy of keeping people productive rather than simply punishing them into submission. If he is alive in the post-war period, the Kingdom under his oversight might be the most functional of the 3 communities, precisely because the relationship between lieutenant and community had been built over time into something more than pure extraction. Ezekiel himself is a question. He is a symbol. The Kingdom loves him in a way that is genuine rather than performed, and his theatrical leadership had been channeling that love toward productivity and community resilience for years. Killing him would create martyrdom and potential instability. Humiliating him publicly, which is very much in Negan's behavioural repertoire, might be more effective. Demonstrate that the theatre was always hollow, that the performance of sovereignty was exactly that, and give the Kingdom's people a real picture of what authority actually looks like in this world. There is a version of this where Ezekiel, stripped of his theatrical identity by a public humiliation that the community witnesses, retains his essential character and eventually becomes, quietly and slowly, one of the most significant figures in whatever resistance eventually organises in the alternative history's later years. Alexandria, with its engineering capacity, its trading connections, and its physical infrastructure, gets managed differently from the farming communities. Negan had always valued Alexandria. in a more personal and strategic way than the Kingdom or Hilltop. His Season 7 visits there had a quality of genuine engagement that his interactions with other communities lacked. He was interested in what Alexandria was, not just what it could produce. In the post-war settlement, Alexandria might develop as the saviour economy's manufacturing and logistics hub, the place where the things that cannot be grown are made, and the place from which the tribute collection network is coordinated. That role would give Alexandria slightly more internal autonomy than the purely agricultural communities, because a hub requires functional specialists, and those specialists require conditions in which they can actually work. What Negan does not do in any of these settlements is forget that these communities try to kill him. The structural accommodations he makes are pragmatic, not forgiving. The tribute rates might be adjusted slightly, the timelines extended for communities rebuilding after the war's damage, the specific forms of enforcement varied to avoid the most counterproductive provocations. But the fundamental terms are the same as they were before the war: half of everything. Personal loyalty to Negan. Disarmament. The war taught Negan something, but what it taught him was not mercy. It taught him that underestimating communities' capacity for organised resistance is a strategic mistake he cannot repeat. The post-war settlements are more carefully managed than the pre-war arrangements were, but they are not more generous. Part 5. The stability problem. The previous script we made about Negan versus Rick explored the fundamental tension in Negan's model. It was built on fear, and fear without genuine hope creates the conditions for its own eventual collapse. A Negan military victory does not solve that problem. It might actually make it worse. The communities that tried to fight and lost carry a specific kind of resentment that is different from the resentment of communities that never tried. The people of the Hilltop, Alexandria and the Kingdom do not simply know that they are living under Negan's system. They know that they tried to change it. They know the names of the people who organised the attempt. They know exactly how close the war came to a different result, because some of them were in the battle and saw it. They are not naive about what they are living under in the way that earlier, more passive vassal communities might have been. They have been educated about their own situation by the process of attempting to resist it, and that education does not disappear with a military defeat. This awareness does not immediately produce another rebellion. The military reality after Negan's victory is completely clear. They lost, and the fighting capacity they assembled across 2 seasons is destroyed or neutralised. Any immediate attempt at renewed resistance would be crushed faster and more completely than the first attempt. The window for organised military action is closed, at least for a generation. But awareness has a long half-life. It persists through leadership changes and generational transitions. The stories people tell their children about what was attempted and why and how close it came to working are the material from which future organising eventually grows. The Walking Dead itself understood this. The show planted the seeds of future conflict in nearly every quiet scene of apparent stability during its middle seasons. In the alternative history, those seeds are planted deeper and watered by more specific and personal grievances. There is also the question of what Negan's victory does to his own internal dynamics. The war years cost the Saviours significantly. The Sanctuary siege left many fighters dead or injured from the Walker Horde. The Coalition's systematic attacks on outposts, including the satellite outpost that Carol and Daryl's group wiped out at the start of Season 6, had killed experienced fighters. By the end of the actual war, even with saviour tactical victories, the organisation was meaningfully smaller and less capable than it had been at its peak. In the alternative, where Eugene's sabotage does not happen and the final battle plays out in the field, the battle itself costs both sides. The Coalition is destroyed, but the Saviours absorb casualties too. Negan wins with fewer soldiers than he started the war with, against communities that have now demonstrated the organisational capacity to mount a sustained multi-year challenge to his authority. The victory is real, but the cost is visible, and the visibility of the cost is itself a kind of information about the limits of his power. The most significant ongoing threat in a Negan victory world is the one the actual show introduced after all-out war ended: the Whisperers. In the actual timeline, the Whisperer threat emerged during a period of relative stability following the war, when the communities had rebuilt some of their capacity and were operating with the kind of surplus that allows for attention to external threats. In the alternative timeline, the communities are weaker, less unified, producing at minimum capacity under tribute extraction, and governed by leaders who are either collaborators or survivalists rather than people with genuine community mandate. The Whisperers moving through saviour territory would present a challenge that Negan's entire system of deterrence, through visible, personalised violence, could not easily answer. Negan's deterrence model works on people who understand the social contract being violated. It works on communities that have something to lose within his system. It does not work on people who have deliberately rejected all social contracts and are using the walkers themselves as weapons and camouflage. You cannot iron someone's face in front of their community, as an example, if you do not know which face belongs to a Whisperer and which to a compliant tribute payer. Alpha's strategy of the Pike Massacre, the ostentatious display of killed community members on stakes along a border that the Whisperers had declared, was designed precisely to demonstrate that Negan-style deterrence has no answer for the Whisperers' approach. You can respond by killing Whisperers, but killing Whisperers requires finding them first, and finding them requires engaging with a threat that dissolves into the surrounding walker population whenever it chooses. The Saviour's organisational model, which was excellent at projecting force against identified targets, was not designed for counterinsurgency against an enemy that does not exist as a discrete organisation between its attacks. Negan would fight the Whisperers differently from how Rick's coalition fought them, but it is genuinely not clear that he would fight them better. He has more fighters. He has more resources at the start of the conflict. He has a more unified command structure. But he has communities that are already psychologically worn down by the tribute system and a recent unsuccessful war, communities that have less capacity to absorb the psychological shock of the Pike Massacre, and a leadership style that does not easily translate into the kind of distributed, community-based resistance that eventually defeated Alpha in the actual timeline. Part 6. What happens to the specific people? This is the section that tends to matter most to Walking Dead fans, and it's worth going through carefully. The theory has to account for specific characters, rather than just broad structural outcomes. Rick Grimes. As established, Rick almost certainly does not survive the immediate aftermath of a military defeat. Not because of cruelty, but because Negan is pragmatic enough to understand that Rick alive is a different kind of threat than Rick dead. The most generous version of Rick's fate in a Negan victory is a visible public death that is given meaning, an execution that is framed as a consequence of Rick's choices rather than Negan's will, designed to give the communities someone specific to mourn, rather than a vague ongoing threat to fear. Negan understands optics. He would want Rick's death to mean something productive for his system. Carl Grimes. This is the most heartbreaking element of the alternative history, and not for the obvious reason. In the actual timeline, Carl died of a walker bite in the Season 8 midpoint, and his dying plea for mercy was the emotional engine of Rick's decision to spare Negan. In a version where Negan wins, Carl is still alive at the war's conclusion. He watched his father die, or whatever version of Rick's end occurred. He is the child of the man who tried to destroy Negan's system, raised in that system's shadow. Negan's relationship with Carl across seasons 7 and 8 was one of the show's more genuinely interesting dynamics. He took an evident liking to Carl, showed him around the sanctuary, treated him with a kind of rough affection that was completely unlike how he treated Rick. In a victory scenario, this interest almost certainly continues. Carl under Negan's victory is perhaps the most fascinating character position in the entire alternative history. The son of the defeated enemy, kept alive by the victor's genuine fondness, caught between his father's memory and the reality of the world he has to survive in. Carl Grimes could, in this version, become something no one in the actual timeline ever became. Someone who was genuinely shaped by both Rick's world and Negan's. Maggie Rhee. As discussed, most likely exiled rather than executed. Her fate connects directly to the future of the hilltop, which connects directly to the region's food supply, which connects directly to whether Negan's system remains economically viable. She's too dangerous to leave in place, too valuable as a productive community leader to simply destroy, and too pregnant in the immediate aftermath for any visible act against her to play well with the communities Negan needs to keep functioning. Maggie in exile is a slower problem for Negan than Maggie at the hilltop, but it is still a problem. People who love Maggie do not forget where she is. Daryl Dixon, the most genuinely uncertain outcome in the alternative history. Negan tried to break Daryl in Season 7, and failed. He tried offering him a lieutenant position and got the same stubborn resistance. In a world where Negan has won the war and Daryl has no allies left, the calculus changes, but it is not clear that Daryl himself changes. He might be the version of himself that works in isolation and covert disruption rather than open resistance, the one who disappears into the woods rather than submitting. He might be the most significant ongoing operational problem Negan faces in the alternative history's first years, not Carol, who is more strategic, but Daryl, who is simply too committed to his own code to integrate into any system that offends it. Michonne. Her fate depends heavily on what happens to Rick. If Rick dies, Michonne's continued existence is in some sense a Negan choice rather than a Michonne choice. She is extraordinarily dangerous, clearly, but she is also the person Rick loved most, and Negan has a pattern of using people's relationships as leverage, rather than simply eliminating threats when he could use them instead. The most likely version of Michonne in the alternative history is one who is alive but constrained, present in a community that is under saviour authority, grieving Rick, but not yet in a position to act on that grief in any meaningful way. Eugene Porter. This is the most different character in the alternative history from who he was in the actual timeline. In the actual show, Eugene's arc is about a man who pretended to be someone he was not and gradually became closer to that person through the choices he made under pressure. His bullet sabotage, the decision that won the war for Rick, is the culmination of that arc. In the alternative history, where Eugene stays loyal and his bullets work, he has made the opposite choice. He is the person whose decision enabled Negan's victory. Living with that, within the sanctuary, with access to comfortable living conditions and intellectual resources, but also with the knowledge of what his loyalty enabled, would be an extraordinary psychological weight for a character already defined by the dissonance between his self-image and his actions. Gabriel Stokes. In the actual timeline, Gabriel survived the war and continued as Alexandria's spiritual leader. In the alternative, Gabriel's most significant action during the war was his escape from the sanctuary with Dr. Carson, which led to Carson's death but ultimately contributed to the ongoing disruption of Negan's position. In a Negan wins scenario, Gabriel is alive, possibly still at Alexandria, still the community's priest. His function in a saviour-dominated community would be interesting. He provides the spiritual infrastructure that communities need to process grief and loss, which is exactly what the communities post-war would require in enormous quantities. Negan might find Gabriel more useful alive than not for exactly this reason. Part 7. The Commonwealth Question. The most consequential long-term question in a Negan wins alternative history is what happens when the saviour system eventually encounters the Commonwealth. In the actual timeline, the Commonwealth was introduced in Season 9 and became the dominant political and social structure of The Walking Dead's later seasons. It is a significantly larger organisation than the Saviours, with a population estimated in the tens of thousands, a professional standing army, a functioning economy with genuine currency, professional specialisation across dozens of trades and skills, and a class system that mirrors the pre-outbreak world's social hierarchies to a degree that no other survivor community had managed. By the standards of the Walking Dead world, the Commonwealth is the most sophisticated surviving civilization in the franchise. The Commonwealth's existence in the alternative history does not depend on Rick winning all-out war. It is geographically separate from the Virginia-Maryland corridor where the Saviours operate, based in Ohio, and was developing independently of the local political conflicts depicted in Season 7 and 8. The radio contact that Eugene made with Stephanie in the actual Season 10 is the first indication of how the Commonwealth was extending its awareness of other communities eastward. But that contact and the Commonwealth's outward expansion were functions of its own internal development, rather than of anything happening in Virginia. In the alternative history, those radio contacts still occur, probably on a similar timeline. Eugene is at the sanctuary, not at the hilltop, but he still has access to radio equipment and the drive to communicate with the wider world that is one of his defining characteristics. The voice that answers from across the distance is still the Commonwealth's. The conversation that begins is just happening with a saviour-aligned Eugene rather than an Alexandria-based one. This changes the nature of the initial contact significantly. In the actual timeline, the Commonwealth's scouts and emissaries were approaching communities that were independent, relatively democratic in their governance, and organised around shared values of the kind that made diplomatic integration relatively straightforward, if politically complex. In the alternative, the communities they eventually make physical contact with are tribute-paying vassals of an authoritarian system that predates them. The Commonwealth would immediately understand the political situation. Its intelligence networks would have been gathering information about the Saviours for some time before any formal contact. Pamela Milton's Commonwealth and Negan's Sanctuary are more alike than either would want to acknowledge. Both are hierarchical. Both derive legitimacy from the provision of order rather than from genuine democratic consent. Both maintain class systems that allocate privilege based on categories that have nothing to do with individual merit. Milton's system is just more elaborately dressed and less personally violent in its maintenance. The difference between a society that irons faces and one that assigns former stockbrokers to positions of authority over former sanitation workers is a difference of kind that both would insist is absolute, and that history would suggest is relative. The meeting between these two systems in the alternative history is not primarily a military confrontation. Neither side has an obvious military advantage over the other at the distance that initially separates them. The Commonwealth's professional army is formidable, but the Saviours have hundreds of experienced fighters and deep knowledge of their territory. A war between them would be costly for both. The more likely initial dynamic is something between diplomacy and intelligence competition, two organisations that recognise each other as the most significant power structures in their respective regions, feeling each other out, each looking for points of leverage, while maintaining the appearance of cooperative engagement. What the Commonwealth has that the saviour system lacks is scale, economic development, and population. What the saviours have that the Commonwealth's expansion needs is territory between Ohio and the East Coast that is currently under a single authority with established tribute relationships with multiple communities. For the Commonwealth's expansion project, absorbing the Saviour system's tributary network without a war is enormously attractive. For the Saviour system, connection to the Commonwealth's economy and population offers access to resources and productive capacity that the local tribute system was never going to generate. The alternative history's version of the Commonwealth arc is therefore a negotiation rather than a confrontation, at least initially. What that negotiation produces depends on whether Negan is still leading the Saviours by the time it occurs, which depends on whether he has solved the succession problem that his victory does not automatically resolve, and whether the Saviour's internal fractures have been managed or have worsened in the post-war period. These are genuinely open questions in the alternative history, and they make the Commonwealth encounter more variable and interesting than a simple military conflict would be. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that the Commonwealth, in either timeline, is the most important political development in The Walking Dead's later years. It represents the first genuinely large-scale attempt to rebuild something resembling modern civilization, with all of the specific contradictions and injustices that entails. In the actual timeline, that attempt is examined through the lens of Rick's coalition's integration into the Commonwealth systems. In the alternative, it is examined through the lens of the Saviour system's encounter with something that is outgrown it in scale, while sharing many of its structural problems. Part 8. The most important thing Negan would have needed to change here is the argument that the franchise itself eventually made through the Croat in Dead City and through Negan's own retrospective statements in the later seasons. Negan's system did not fail, primarily because Rick was too strong or the coalition too large. It failed because of specific, internal vulnerabilities that Negan could have addressed and did not. The first was Simon. Negan's second-in-command was operating on a fundamentally different philosophy of governance than Negan himself, and that discrepancy was not just a management problem, it was a structural threat. Simon believed in elimination where Negan believed in subjugation. Simon's massacre of the scavengers, against Negan's explicit orders, produced the Jadis situation that nearly ended Negan's life and significantly complicated his war effort. Dead City explicitly frames the Croat as the lieutenant Negan should have kept, the one who respected the system and followed the philosophy rather than substituting his own judgment about when to deviate from it. In the alternative history where Negan wins, this internal coherence problem still exists. Simon is still Simon. His massacre of the scavengers still happens. The Jadis complication still occurs. The difference is that in a Negan wins alternative, these are survivable problems rather than contributing factors to his eventual defeat. But they point to a deeper issue. Negan's system was too dependent on Negan personally to adjudicate between lieutenants who had conflicting philosophies. There was no institutional mechanism for resolving the Simon problem without a direct confrontation between them that only Negan could manage. The second vulnerability was information security. Dwight was a mole inside the Saviour command structure for months before his exposure. He fed Rick's coalition information about Saviour movements, plans, and personnel. He arranged for Eugene's bullet sabotage concept to be seeded into the coalition through Gabriel's earlier, failed attempt. He maintained his cover through the entire war until Negan finally identified him. In the alternative history where Eugene stays loyal and the bullets work, Dwight is still a mole, still feeding information to whatever remains of the coalition. The Saviour victory does not magically secure the information environment. It just means the information being shared produces different operational consequences. The third vulnerability, the deepest one, was the same one we explored in the Negan versus Rick script, the absence of loyalty. Negan had compliance, he had fear-based cooperation, he had individual relationships that were genuinely reciprocal. like his with certain lieutenants and his evident interest in Karl, but he did not have the kind of institutional loyalty that would have allowed his system to function effectively in his absence or under pressure. The sanctuary workers' near revolt when Negan was trapped in the trailer during the siege, the willingness of lieutenants to consider Simon's coup, the ease with which Dwight maintained his cover, all of these revealed a system that was unified by one person's presence and fragile in that person's absence. A Negan victory solves the immediate military problem. It does not solve any of these three structural vulnerabilities, which means the alternative history's Negan, the one who won all-out war, spends the years after his victory managing exactly the same internal contradictions that nearly brought his system down during the war. He is now doing it from a position of greater strength, with fewer external threats and more resources. But the character of the system, its inability to generate genuine loyalty, its dependence on personal performance, its tolerance of lieutenants who do not share its foundational philosophy, does not change with the outcome of a single battle. Part 9. What the world eventually becomes. Let us fast forward 10 years from Negan's victory, the same approximate time frame that the franchise covers in its actual timeline between all-out war and the events of Dead City. The Saviour system has stabilised across the mid-Atlantic region. The tribute economies of the Hilltop, the Kingdom, and Alexandria are functioning. The Sanctuary remains the political and economic centre. Negan is still alive, still personally leading the organisation at the beginning of this 10-year period. But he is older now, and the organisational question of succession, which never had to be answered in the actual timeline because the war ended and his power was dismantled, has become urgent by its end. There is no obvious heir to Negan's specific kind of authority. His lieutenants who survived the war, Laura in the place of the dead Simon, the reorganised council, lack the personal charisma and specific psychology that made Negan's authority function. They can enforce. They cannot inspire, and they cannot command the kind of fearful respect that Negan generates simply by being present in a room. The communities under Saviour authority are stable but not flourishing, and the distinction matters enormously. The tribute system extracts enough of their productive capacity that they remain functional, but cannot develop the kind of surplus that would support expansion, innovation, or improvement of their infrastructure in any meaningful way. The Hilltop's agricultural output goes to feed the sanctuary at half rate, and the Hilltop's own people at the remaining half. There is no surplus to expand the Hilltop's cultivated area, to develop new crops, to invest in the kind of agricultural technology that a community with engineers and curious minds might otherwise have developed. The Kingdom's community events and theatrical performances, which were Ezekiel's way of maintaining community morale under terrible conditions, continue in some diminished form, but the budget for them is whatever is left after the tribute, and what is left is not much. Alexandria, with its engineering capacity and its trading connections, is the community best positioned to maintain some level of development under the Saviour system, because its value to Negan was always more strategic than agricultural. He was always more interested in what Alexandria represented, its location, its skilled population, its capacity for specialised production, than in its raw food output. Under the alternative, Alexandria might develop as a kind of manufacturing hub within the Saviour economy, the place where the things that cannot be grown are made, and that role might give it slightly more leverage within the system than the farming communities have. The Whisperer conflict has been fought, in some form, with an outcome that is genuinely difficult to predict with confidence. What we can say is that it has left the Saviour system in a different state than it started, because the Whisperer War always leaves every community in a different state. The Pike Massacre was not a tactic Alpha invented for Rick's network. It is a tactic rooted in the Whisperer's fundamental philosophy, the demonstration that civilization's borders are an illusion, that the dead do not respect them, and that anyone who believes in them is vulnerable. Negan's system, which was built on making its borders very clear and very enforced, would face the Whisperer challenge to those borders in an extremely visceral way. The Commonwealth, in this 10-year version of the alternative history, has established contact with the Saviour system and is in some form of ongoing negotiation or competition with it. The specific nature of their relationship depends on too many variables to state with confidence, but the relationship is real and consequential. The Commonwealth's resources and population put it in a position of structural advantage over the long term. The Saviour system's established territory and tribute network give it leverage in the short term. What emerges between them might be an absorption, the Commonwealth eventually integrating the Saviour-controlled communities as it integrated the communities it contacted in the actual timeline, or a genuine political standoff between two regimes that recognise each other as the most significant entities in their respective regions and are not yet ready for either war or merger. The most likely outcome of the alternative 10-year history, the one that emerges from all the pressures and dynamics we have traced across this video, is that the Walking Dead world is moving toward a recognisable version of the political landscape the actual show eventually depicted. Larger organisations are emerging. The questions of governance and legitimacy, who has the right to make decisions, what people owe to the authority over them, and what that authority owes back, are still the central questions of the post-apocalyptic world. The specific names and structures are different in the alternative. Negan's system, rather than Rick's coalition, is the dominant local power. But the underlying pressures are identical in both timelines, because they are not products of who won all-out war. They are products of the world itself. Civilization has a logic, and that logic eventually asserts itself regardless of which specific people win, which specific battles. The Walking Dead across its full run is fundamentally a story about that logic and what it costs human beings to follow it, in all its iterations and in all its contradictions. A Negan victory changes many things, deeply and permanently and personally, for the specific people who live through it. Carl Grimes, alive under Negan's authority, is one of the most fascinating character possibilities in the franchise's history. Maggie's exile is one of its most painful. Daryl in the woods, unwilling to submit, building something from resistance and obstinacy and sheer refusal, is one of its most compelling unwritten stories. But it does not change what civilization requires. It does not change the fact that the people who survive long enough will eventually be building something that looks more like civilization than like any of the survivor communities we watched in the show's middle seasons. The specific road is darker in the alternative, and the specific people who travel it are different. The destination is less clean, more compromised, and arrived at later. But the direction of travel is the same. Outro Negan told Rick on that night in the clearing that he was going to have to learn to live with what had happened. That Rick was going to go home and find a way to make it work because that was how things were now. That if Rick understood this, really understood it, everything would be fine. And for nearly an entire season, under the weight of Glenn's death and Abraham's death, and the look on his son's face when he understood what his father had agreed to, Rick acted as though Negan might be right. He was almost right. He just did not account for the specific sequence of events that made him wrong. 4 separate moments in seasons 7 and 8, where the outcome balanced on individual choices. Sasha's suicide inside the coffin, creating the chaos that let Rick survive the season 7 finale. Eugene eventually choosing to sabotage the bullets he had spent months manufacturing. Dwight maintaining his cover as a mole through months of active war. Simon massacring the scavengers against explicit orders, and generating the Jadis complication that nearly removed Negan from the board on its own. Change any one of those moments, and the world we have been exploring tonight is the world the franchise inhabits for the rest of its run. What is striking about that alternative, when you really sit with it, is how much it resembles the actual world of the franchise's later seasons in its underlying architecture. Not in its human texture, not in the specific lives and losses and relationships that make The Walking Dead worth caring about, but in the broad political logic. Large organisations managing smaller ones. The question of how to build legitimate authority in a world without institutional precedent. The ongoing pressure from threats that no individual organisation is large enough to handle alone. The slow and painful negotiation between the world that was and the world that is actually available. The specific horror of the alternative history is not that it is simply worse than the actual timeline. It is more complicated than that. Carl Grimes, alive under Negan's authority, is one of the most genuinely fascinating character possibilities in the franchise's history. A boy who grew up knowing Rick's values and watching his father die for them, who's kept alive by the personal fondness of his father's killer, who has to find some way to be himself inside a world shaped entirely by forces opposed to everything his father believed. That character does not exist in the actual timeline. He is one of the alternative's specific losses, and also one of its most interesting unwritten stories. Negan understood some of what civilization requires better than Rick did. Rick understood the rest of it better than Negan did. The actual show tried to hold both of those things true simultaneously for 8 full seasons, which is why it eventually arrived at a place where Negan, imprisoned and changed by years of proximity to people who embodied what he had always lacked, came to see what Rick understood, and then acted on it. The alternative history version of that journey is darker and longer and more expensive in human terms. It probably reaches something like the same destination eventually, because the destination is not about who wins all-out war. It is about what civilization requires, and whether human beings, given enough time and enough pain, eventually figure out that they need each other more than they need to be right about any particular thing. But the people who walk that darker road are walking it without Rick Grimes, without Glenn's specific kind of hope, without the specific and irreplaceable things that the people who died in the alternative's version of events would have contributed to whatever gets built afterward. And that absence matters, not because it changes the direction of history in the larger sense, but because the texture of life is made of specific people and specific choices and specific moments of grace. And the alternative history has fewer of those, in precisely the places where the actual timeline was most luminous. There's a great deal more to explore in the Walking Dead universe. The theories, the what-ifs, the lore the show planted, and then years later returned to. For now, that is enough for tonight. Get some rest.